All right, so we're going to start a new study in Deuteronomy. It's hard to believe that I asked on Sunday morning how long we had been going in the Torah. Sue thought it was maybe a year and a half. I'm not 100% sure. Anybody else have any good ideas?
Mm,
No?
Longer than that.
You think so? I don't remember. But at any rate, so we're in the last book of the Torah, Deuteronomy. My plan is to be here probably 9 weeks, but if we
Hello.
get chatty, it might be a little bit longer than that. All right, so let's get started. And so I got a couple questions. So in the past, how many have studied the book of Deuteronomy? Anybody study the book of Deuteronomy in the past?
I've read it. I never studied it.
Okay, read it, never studied it.
Maybe
Never
in
studied it.
Disciple one, but I'm not sure.
Maybe in Disciple One, not sure. I can tell you Disciple One, it is, we do a little bit, but not a whole lot. Um, so nobody has studied it then.
Mm-mm.
Okay. So besides Sue, has anybody else read the book of Deuteronomy? And when I say read the book of Deuteronomy, I'm talking about reading it all the way through.
Nope.
No?
Mm-mm. No.
Okay. So, based on your limited perspective, what do you think the book of Deuteronomy is all about? Any good
Well,
ideas?
they're moving into the promised land, so I
Right.
think it would be the living within the promised land.
Okay, so it kind of makes sense. We kind of left off in Numbers that they were getting ready to move into the promised land. So this would be the next um, book possibly to move that story forward. Okay. Anybody
It,
else?
well,
I
if you
think
were
this is
talking,
where a lot of the laws were laid out.
Okay. It's a lot
The
of
law.
laws are laid out there. Okay. Deb?
if you were talking about the symmetry of the books, so
Mm-hmm.
if you have the five books and Leviticus is in the middle, that this one should be more like Genesis again.
Okay. All right. Good. Anybody else? Any other
Um,
ideas?
I have a silly question.
Okay.
What does Deuteronomy mean?
Hold on to that question for a sec.
Okay.
the
Um, we'll
the
get there.
Okay.
commandments are
Al
Deuteronomy 5.
Alan, can you say that again?
Yes, the Ten Commandments are in the fifth chapter of Deuteronomy.
Okay, so Deuteronomy holds, and somebody said laws already, and so we got the Ten Commandments that are found there. Okay, also found elsewhere. So
It-
it's go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was just thinking, it's a new way. It's. I think Moses doesn't he like reiterate their covenant that they have with God, and
Okay,
it's how they should live once they get into
okay,
land.
all right. So it's that reiteration of the law. Okay, maybe. So why should we take up our time, 8 weeks or 9 weeks to study Deuteronomy? Is it worthwhile or not?
Probably is, but I wouldn't know till the end.
Mhm. Well, if it is, like you said, this kind of mirroring, then just like Genesis, it should be how the God's people are reunited with God.
Okay. All right.
I think that studying a little bit more concrete, maybe. Deb, I think you're right. But how and why the law came about and why people still nowadays, especially Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, why they still do this and why what it was all about, what was its purpose.
Okay.
How did it influence their thinking, even getting into the New Testament? Because, in most of the New Testament, we're still dealing with first century Jews.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. So it had impact on the first century Jews and those first century Christians. So um it was worthwhile for them. So in some ways, oops, it can be worthwhile for us as well. So somebody asked the question, what does Deuteronomy mean? Well, it's a Greek compound word, the two Greek words that are put together, and it means second law. Okay. It's second law. And what Deuteronomy is about, in some ways, we think about Deuteronomy, we say, oh, it's about the law. But in some ways, as Mark said, we're in a place we left off where we have this group of people that, a new generation. Remember, we always got to think it's a new generation. When we think about the book of Numbers, when Numbers started, we had the first generation. I remember we have the spies in the land. They say, we can't go in and take the land. There's giants there, and all that stuff. So they come back, talk to the people, and the people say, we're not going to go. And so God says, okay, you don't want to go. I will abide by your decision. So they wander again for that 40 years.
Mm.
And so that one generation has died off, except for very few people. And now we have that second generation. And so, in some ways, Deuteronomy is a retelling of the law to a new generation who are about to enter the promised land. And so, in some ways, this is a retelling or also a kind of remembering because these folks are new. All right. And so if we kind of look at Genesis, I mean, if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, it says, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law, saying, the Lord our God said to us in Horeb, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. And he moves on. And so, in the very introductory verses, it says, the purpose of Deuteronomy is to explain. Now, when you hear the word explain, what do you think? What does that mean?
To direct,
Say it again, Mark.
to direct you.
To okay, to direct you.
It's
Okay.
not really giving you reason for, it's basically telling you how it's going to be.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we look at that Hebrew word for explain, it's be'er, which means to bring understanding. So as we begin to think about Deuteronomy, it's not all about new laws. Okay. So it's not a collection of new laws. It's taking those laws that are there. In fact, some of them are the exact same laws or the same laws with additions to. So it becomes a commentary on the law that God has already given up to this point. Okay. And it's a reiteration that honors the wisdom of the laws previously given, but applies them in new ways. So we got to think about this idea that, the law was given and the law was given to a generation in a particular time, in a particular place. And so now we have a second generation that's looking at these laws and in some ways in a different place. And so there needs to be a kind of reorientation or a reinterpretation of this law within their particular context. Now, as we think about that, what does that mean for us as as Christians today.
It reminds me
Just
of
like that second. Go ahead.
oh, it reminds me of last week when we were talking about the women wanting to inherit and kind of taking a look at things that had been in place previously and saying, well, wait a minute, what about now? You know,
Yep.
um, situation's different. So things are fluid.
Okay. Fluid, dynamic. You know, life is always changing, and you have these laws that are really not meant to be static. Because remember when we talked about the law, okay, the law was not like, just meant to be, okay, do not murder. The law was really there. Okay, we have this law, do not murder, but let's meditate on that. What does it really mean not to murder? Why is that important for us in community? So it really becomes a springboard, if you will, to meditate and think about the laws and how they apply and what they say to a particular people in a particular place, which can change over the course of time. And so for us, we're in the 21st century. Okay. These laws were given eons ago. But, what do they mean for us in our particular context? Just like they there were then. So Moses undertook to explain, okay, not to give some commentary on these laws. Okay, and if we think about this for a second, it's like we all have moments of choice before the tree of knowledge. So if we go back to the book of Genesis, we all have those moments just like Adam and Eve were before the tree of knowing good and bad. And the Israelites were before the Mount of Sinai, and same kind of thing, and Yahweh or God is saying, don't give your allegiance to things of your own creation. Choose life, choose wisdom, and follow my commands. So one of the things we have to think about when we think about Deuteronomy or we think about the Torah in general is that the laws that were there were not just meant for the original hearers. It's meant for those who come after as well, because each one of us is swept up into the drama of standing before that tree and making a choice. All of us stand there before the promised land and have to make a choice. So every one of us needs to see ourselves at that moment every day. And that's really the function of the book of Deuteronomy, is help us to remember that we stand on the precipice of the promised land. Are we going to choose life? Are we going to choose wisdom? Or are we going to choose our own folly? So what we're going to do is we are going to look at a video. It comes from the Bible Project. It's a summary of the book. So it's kind of an overview. I'm going to get started. I'm hoping I click the share speaker thing, so I hope it works. So let me know if it doesn't.
The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name, from a Greek word, deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are two outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into two parts themselves. Let's just dive in and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses first of all summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the Ten Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is the famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says how. Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation, the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So, for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors, and it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so, too, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law, and you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9, and he quotes a law from Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses says this. He says, "I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile. Which is kind of a downer, but then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile, at any point, Moses says they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then of blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
Okay. So I should listen to the video. Anything strike you? Anything sound interesting to you?
The idea of it as a retelling, I mean, I think in Numbers, Moses had died, and we were looking at Joshua. But now here's Moses again, and it's a retelling of the same story, but that there's nuance that is being brought out.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Mhm.
All right. So, um, so some key takeaways for me is that, the entire book of Deuteronomy it's a single speech. Um, so you think about Genesis, you think about Exodus and all those, that they're books that are written and cover large spans of time. But
Mhm.
this entire, Deuteronomy is a single speech that Moses is going to make before the community, before he dies and they enter the promised land. Second of all, that Deuteronomy, while it has some new laws, really is a collection and commentary on laws and instruction that have already been given. And the third is the reminder, as I said before, that you know, we have a choice that's set before us every day. We can either choose alliance to the things that we create, or we can choose life and wisdom by God's commands. And so, just to kind of summarize, this is the um, uh, kind of poster that he kind of created while he told the story. So we have these three different sections of Deuteronomy. So two speeches that are bookends for these collections of laws. So if we kind of look at it, we could call it three specific movements. So movement one is the sermons of Moses, chapter 1 to 11, where thematically it's, kind of listen and love. Movement number two, chapters 12 to 26, the laws. And so the theme really there is really about laws. And then movement number three starts at chapter 26, um, 16, and moves on through the end of the book, talking about curses for breaking the law. So this idea thematically of blessing and curse. Now, one of the things that he mentioned that's very prominent in that first section is what's known as the Shema. And really it's got to do with this Deuteronomy 1, 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And so this little piece of scripture right here called the Shema becomes very, very important in not only, sort of the thematically for what's happening in Deuteronomy, but really is the hang or the piece on which Israel kind of hangs its hat. We have another little video here. We're gonna watch about the Shema, and then we're gonna talk about it. Okay.
For thousands of years, every morning and evening, Jewish people have prayed these well-known words as a way of expressing their devotion to God. They're called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. Now, the first word of the Shema is hear or listen, which in Hebrew is pronounced Shema. That's where the prayer gets its name. Now, Shema is a really common word in the Hebrew Bible, and it's obvious why. Hearing is a very universal activity. It's usually connected with the ear, as in Proverbs chapter 20. Ears that shema and eyes that see, the Lord has made them both. Now that seems basic enough, but if you look at the other ways that Hebrew authors can use the word Shema, they use it to mean more than just let sound waves enter your ear. In Hebrew, Shema can also mean pay attention to or focus on. So when Leah, who wasn't loved by her husband Jacob, she has a son, and she names him Simon, or in Hebrew, Shim'on, because, she says, the Lord has sham'ad, that I am unloved. So Shema means to hear and to pay attention to, and even more. It can also mean responding to what you hear. This is why so many of the cries for help in the book of Psalms begin with a call that God listen. Psalm 27, verse 7. Shema my voice when I call, O Lord. Be merciful, answer me. So asking God to Shema is at the same time asking God to act, to do something. It's similar to when God asks people to listen. Like when the people of Israel come to Mount Sinai, God says, if you Shema me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Now there's a couple interesting things about this verse in Exodus. In Hebrew, the word Shema is repeated twice in this sentence to give it emphasis. If you Shema, Shema, meaning listen closely. But also notice that from God's point of view, listening is basically the same as keeping the covenant. So when God asks the people to Shema, what he means is that they listen and obey. And that's the last fascinating thing about Shema. In ancient Hebrew, there is no separate word for obey, meaning to carry out the wishes of someone who knows better than you or is in authority over you. So in the Bible, if you want to say, I will listen and do what you say, you use the single word, Shema. In Hebrew, listening and doing are two sides of the same coin. This is why later in Israel's history, when the people were breaking their covenant promises to God, the Hebrew prophets would say things like, they have ears, but they're not listening. The Israelites, of course, could hear just fine, but they weren't actually listening, or else they would act differently. And so in the end, listening in the Bible is about giving respect to the one speaking to you and doing what they say. Real listening takes effort and action, and that's the Hebrew word Shema.
Okay.
For thousands of years, every morning.
So if we think about the Shema, I said that it is very important to our Jewish brothers and sisters. In fact, it becomes the centerpiece of their daily and morning prayer. So the Shema is repeated or recited twice a day.
Mm.
Um, and its recitation is regarded by observant Jews as a biblical commandment, something they're called to do. Um, it is also considered to be an essential prayer in Judaism, and it's an affirmation of God's singularity and kingship. Um, the first verse, Hear, O Lord, our God, the Lord is one, um, is probably the best known in all of Jewish liturgy. It's recited at the climactic moment of the final prayer of Yom Kippur. Traditionally, it's the last word said before someone dies, and it's recited with hands placed over the eyes. Okay, so if we look at the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And then, they're saying that with their hands over the eyes, and then under their breath, they say, Blessed is the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. And so this becomes the most central declaration of who God is. Okay. So for us in Christianity, what do you think would be a similar declaration? Or in the early church, what was a declaration that would be kind of similar?
At Jesus's baptism, this is my son in whom I am well pleased.
Okay, that declaration comes from God, but what about from the people?
Mm.
It's
I was going to
simple.
say the Lord's Prayer, but I'm
No, not the Lord's Prayer. Jesus is Lord.
mm,
You know, if you think about it, within the Christian faith, what is the most essential declaration? Jesus Christ is Lord. And so, if we look at the Shema, we have, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then the prayer kind of moves on, and it's got three parts to it. And, this little section is really a summary of pieces that were taken from different spots. So, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, comes from Deuteronomy. Um, if you obey my commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain on your head. So the blessings comes from Deuteronomy. Um, and then lastly, a piece comes from uh, Numbers. And so let's take a oops, let's go back. Let's take a look at that prayer for a second. Okay, so hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. So as we think about that part of scripture, what do you take away from that? So we got here, so that Shema. What do we learn about that word?
Well,
To listen and to do.
Say that again, Mark.
To listen and to do.
Okay, so it's hear and respond or obey. All right, great.
yeah, I was thinking about that, and it strikes me that we talk about how it's grace but not works that matter. But in this case, it's sort of like the hearing and the doing is wrapped into one, and so there is no way that you can, with Shema, hear the word and not act upon it. And so I think that's kind of that messaging comes through in the New Testament also. Um, yeah.
Okay.
I
Yep.
think Jesus brought that up
Say that again,
when
Sue.
they said the great commandments. Well, this is one of the great commandments.
Guess what? Here, spoiler alert. That's the gospel lesson for this next week. The greatest commandment, Mark chapter 12. All right. So yeah, and so is it a great accident or coincidence that in when a scribe asked Jesus something that he goes back to the Old Testament?
No, he knew what he was talking about.
Yeah. And in fact, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, or with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. All right. But then,
He
it's
expanded
interesting.
it.
Yeah, exactly. He expands it there second, and you'll love your neighbor as yourself. And so, Jesus is doing the same thing that any, good rabbi is going to do. He's taking the teaching and kind of expanding it. And so if we look at this, and this becomes like the hinge point for Jewish belief, and it's a hinge point really for the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, what is the function of the law then?
To love God, love your neighbor.
Okay, so the function of the law we say is okay, we obey the law, we're loving God. And okay, and vis-a-vis we love our neighbor, right? But could it also be that in our hearing and obeying, that it's not only that we're giving love to God, but in some ways we're experiencing God's love because, Jesus expands this, but, if you're going to love the Lord your God, okay, it means that what are you going to do? Well, you're going to love your neighbor and you're going to recognize, what's that impotence really to love our neighbor, but just the realization that each one of us has been created by God. Each one of us has inherent worth. Um, and so, that becomes, an important part of this, of the law when we think about that. Now, what does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might? What does that mean?
Well, one thing I'm thinking about is on that graphic that you have up there that came up in that video about Israel is to worship. Oh my gosh, my cat just tipped the computer. Sorry, Daisy, I didn't mean to. Um, this idea of worshiping only the one God, because if you worship all these other deities, entities, that all kinds of other problems arise. And I don't remember specifically what was said in the video, but I remember there was some stuff in there um, about that becoming problematic. And so, sorry, the cat distracted me with tipping the computer, so I forget where I was going with that. But I just it was like striking me when you were talking about that the purpose of the law and related to what you were saying is to get people to worship only the one true God, because otherwise in community um you have problems when you worship all these other things.
Okay, yeah. Other thoughts?
Simplistic terms, I think it means you need to really, really, really mean it.
Okay. Okay, yep, yep.
You know, there's a lot of people. I mean, I know there's people out there that swear they're Christians and up, down, sideways, and backwards, and they don't act like it. They don't show it. That you can tell that they don't mean it.
Hmm.
This is like you really, really, really need to mean this.
Yeah, so this is like total investment. Because when it says heart, soul, and might, it's kind of you need to love the Lord your God with being, your entire being. Um, and what does it mean that these words that I command you today shall be on your heart? What does that mean?
Never forget.
Okay. And so when we heart and head are kind of similar, so we will so we won't forget. Okay, so there's this idea that these are important that we won't forget. So how do we then not forget? How do we what are the ways that we keep them on our hearts?
Well, practice makes perfect. So, reciting them, singing the words of
Okay?
hymns, reading and memorizing scripture, so that you can access it. Like Jesus knew it inside, outside, up, down, backwards, and he's nailed to a cross and reciting Psalms. Just so it becomes so internalized. That's where you go when you are feeling stretched or you need to help someone, that you have the words of God at your on the tip of your tongue.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, if we look further down, you shall talk of them what? When you sit in your house,
Mhm.
when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. So if we think about those, what does that mean?
Should be on your mind constantly
Yeah, it's in
All consuming.
all
and
yeah,
everything you do.
it's an all the time kind of thing. It's not just a weekend thing or a nighttime thing or a daytime thing. That, it's all the time, and we're going to talk about them. Now, when we say talk about that, what's your what's your kind of vision for that? Because I mean, Deb used the word, and I think it was her, to memorize them, and that in some ways that by memorization they become internalized. And we see the best example of this is in Jesus as he's hanging on the cross, as she mentioned. He's able to glean and hang on to pieces of scripture that had just been totally soaked into his being.
Well, this is an I mean, I don't think you need to go to this extreme. But I had a friend in high school who her parents were super Catholics, and literally everywhere in her house there were signs all over the place. Like there was a sign taped on the television that said, "Would Jesus be watching this?" Um, so I mean, that's an extreme you could go to, I think, but I mean, it was like a constant reminder. Literally, you could not turn around in that house without, you know, and it had a kind of a detrimental effect on one of the teenagers that grew up in that house, who like ran, screaming away from all of it. Um, but I think that's a case where you can say, like, what the parents were trying to do was to make this point of keeping it
Hmm.
on your mind all the time.
Right. Yeah. So you want it kind of always before you, but we can take that to an extreme. Um, but I think one of the ways that we do it as well is this idea of, because when we think about memorizing or that kind of thing, internalizing it becomes in some ways maybe an individual type of exercise. But when we talk about them, okay, because you got to remember that who are we talking to here? We're talking to people that were uber community minded. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house. When you sit in your house, it's not like I'm sitting in my house here and my neighbor can't hear me. You know, so that expectation of privacy isn't there. So, when you're in your house, you're going to hear that. When you walk on the way, when you walk, typically, are you walking by yourself? No, you're walking with other people. And then, when you lie and when you rise, talk about these. So, it's not only, I believe, just a singular focus, but it's the idea here when we're looking and loving God, it's not just me, but it's a community. And so we talk about those kinds of things.
I had asked Herman if this is where the phylacteries and the mezuzahs come from.
Yeah, it is. That's where we're going next.
Oh,
So
sorry.
no, 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 no. That's a great segue. So if we kind of, go down further, because, Moses is saying that, the law is really, really super important. Okay. That it's through the obeyance, hearing and obeying the law that we love God, and we also are able to feel God's love back. Okay. And so we need to have that ever before us. And so one way we have it ever before us is we talk about that. Okay. Another way is, what does it say here? You shall teach them diligently to your children. All right. Um, so it's that talking kind of thing. And then as we get down here, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And so Sue used a couple of words that might sound a little foreign to us. What words were they?
Phylacteries and mezuzahs.
Okay, what's a phylactery and
It
mezuzah?
ties it. It's a scroll or
Little box.
yeah. But it contains like a scripture, and it's tied around your forehead. This is like the super Orthodox
Yep.
people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there. It's in front of your forehead. And then the mezuzah is like almost every Jew I've ever known has it. It's a piece of the Torah that's nailed onto their door.
Mhm.
Yep.
We
Yep.
have
They
them.
have to see it, and they should touch it every time they go in the house.
Mhm.
Oh, really? I didn't know
Don't
that.
touch it and kiss it.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah.
we have them on our front and back door because the people that, we bought this house from 20 years ago were Jewish, so I haven't taken them down.
Yeah. And so that becomes part of the trying to have this reminder, the importance of the law ever before us, that, okay, they would wear it on their bodies. It would be at the door when they go and when they leave. And that's where you shall have them on your doorpost of the house and on your gates. And so we think about that, it becomes, kind of uber important. Okay.
What Sue was talking about, the thing being on the doorpost, or not the doorpost, but the little box that they wear, the men
Phylactery.
do. And they have black straps around their arms too
Mhm.
Yep.
when they're praying.
And so as we think about this and we think about this idea, what what does it really mean for us today, as Christ followers in the 21st century?
Mhm.
I'm still struck by that word Shema about the hear and do and the listen and pay attention so that it's on your mind all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how good are we at that?
Not, not good.
Yeah, we're not really good at it, um, keeping it ever before us. And, you know, I think that Moses knew and God knew that they weren't going to be very good at it. And so, gave them, in their context and in their time, very practical ways in which they could always keep it before them. And as we think about that, what are some practical ways then that we can keep the law before us?
Um, that we just have to remember what we're supposed to do.
Okay. Well, I just asked and everybody told me that their remember is not very good.
Yeah,
Write
but
things
that
down.
I didn't say that we were good at it. I said that we were supposed to.
Okay. And
Well,
and I
I mean, I think reading the Bible and just
Reading the Bible,
yeah,
definitely.
uh-huh.
singing
Well,
hymns.
frankly, I don't think the guys that walk around with the boxes on their heads are doing such a good job either,
No,
because I
but
know quite a few of them.
yeah, I get it. I get it. I get it. Um, but I guess, and this is sort of that ongoing struggle to you know, keep the presence of God always before us. That we keep God before us, and the remembering that that we love Him, He loves us.
It's so difficult some in today's day and age because it seems like we get battered on all sides by everything but that. you know, it's
Yeah.
it's really hard to stay focused.
There are things that like I mean, I'm thinking about commercials where
Yeah.
you have, phrases that pop up. We were listening to the Eagles game as we were driving down yesterday, and this commercial for PNC Bank kept coming up, and they kept saying, "Brilliant PNC Bank is brilliantly boring." This is stupid since 1865. And it just was repeated over and over again, and that kind of like repetition ended up making us memorize the stupid phrase. So,
Hmm.
that is, one way of going about it. But also, I'm thinking like in this modern day and age or whatever, with a smartphone, you can have a Bible app that sends you a phrase every day, or if you have a wall calendar that has verses on it or
Hmm.
something like that, at least you're reading it and maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
coming up. And you know, maybe some days you gloss over it, maybe other days something resonates, but you're seeing scripture and reminders, and something might catch your ear or your eye out of
Hmm.
something.
Yeah, I know I've talked before about praying the hours. It at particular times you take breaks in your day to kind of remember. Uh, so it becomes, important for us because we're always one step away from forgetting.
Mm.
And I think one of the big scary things for me um, is really verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children.
Mm.
That as we continually move on, our children have become more, not even just biblically illiterate, but godly illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that becomes scary because when this generation, the next generation dies off, if nobody's teaching the kids,
Hmm.
what happens? And
That's a
so,
really tricky too, because there's pushback.
oh yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. I'm not saying it's an easy one, but in some ways, it becomes kind of important. And I guess I become more keenly aware as my kids are having kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we have the grandkids, um, which is pretty important. I mean, I make it a point since the two girls were about two. Um, each one gets a shoebox, and each one you know goes with Pop Pop to go fill the shoebox. But when we're filling the shoebox, we're telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
So my hope is at least, they have some of that because, you know, from my kids' standpoint, some are better about telling the story and some are less about telling the story. Um, but I don't want it to die out, and I think that becomes pretty important for us individually, but also kind of as a church as well. Any other thoughts?
Random thoughts, but with a common thread. Okay. As far as uh, doing the prayers, if you develop a ritual and like a particular behavior that you do on a regular basis, the challenge is, well, first, if you make it as a ritual, you're going to be doing it on a regular basis. But the challenge to me is keeping it different or introducing new things to that ritual so that it becomes interesting and is not just done automatically without thinking. So there's a little bit more meaning to it. So that would be some of this teachings and remembering the laws and remembering the stories. But keep in mind that as the children are little, they're soaking up all this information. That's the best time to get them introduced to all the stories because it will stay with them. So they will grow into teenagers, and then they'll want to spread their wings and do their own thing and develop their own ideas. But it's until they become 40 and plus, they come back into more of the traditional things that they learned as children. Usually because by that time they're having their own children and they're processing all that information again. So
Yeah.
it's there.
Yep, that's the hope. That's the hope. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Okay, so if we go forward, this is where we're kind of going with things. So um it was starting out at 8 weeks. And then I looked at this week and said, well, the introduction probably should be on its own. So we're at 9 weeks. So it's now a 9 week study. So week 2, we're going to be in Deuteronomy 1, and we're going to really talk a lot about the importance of remembering. We're going to go through Deuteronomy 4, obedience to God's command. We're going to talk about, circle back to the Shema again and the greatest command, 7 covenant and blessings of obedience, warning against idolatry, so on and so forth. So if you're going to kind of read ahead a little bit,
Mm.
next week, might want to read Deuteronomy chapter 1.
Is that 1 through 3? One, 2, and 3, or just
No,
one?
just one. Just one. Yeah. Hey, if you want to read all of
Well,
them.
but you go from 1 to 4 to 6. So I'm wondering where does 2 and 3 fit in, and
Well,
where does 5 fit in?
so it's kind of when you have a book that has so many chapters, I didn't kind of chunk it up like, okay, this is 1 through this. They took snippets of each one.
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense or not, but yeah. So hey, if you read chapter 1, you'll be ahead. If you read chapter 1 to 3, we'll give you a gold star.
There you go.
In the Jewish Torah, their Bible is not their books of the Bible are in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. I mean, they have Jewish different names.
Yeah, they have different names. Well, some of them are different names, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually if you look at the Hebrew Bible, it's arranged a bit differently than the Christian
How many books
Bible.
do they have in their Bible?
Same.
Same.
Yep.